We're going to go ahead and stand and sing before we all get comfortable and let all that chicken digest, and then we can fall asleep on Brian. Shh, don't tell him. All right, we're going to go ahead and sing Across the Lands. Let's go ahead and stand. You're the Word of God the Father, from before the world began. Every star and every planet has been fashioned by your hand. All creation holds together by the power of your voice. Let the skies declare your glory. Let the land and seas rejoice. You're the author of creation. You're the Lord of every man. And your cry of love rings out across the lands. Yet you left the gaze of angels, came to seek and save the lost, and exchange the joy of heaven for the anguish of a cross. With a prayer you fed the hungry, with a word you calmed the sea. Yet how silently you suffered, that the guilty may go free. You're the author of creation. You're the Lord of every man. And your cry of love rings out across the land. With a shout you rose victorious, wresting victory from the grave, and ascended into heaven, leading captives in your reign. Now you stand before the Father, interceding for your own. From each tribe and tongue and nation, you are leading sinners home. You're the author of creation. You're the Lord of every man. And your cry of love rings out across the land. You may be seated. We're going to have some updates and reports by both Jared and Brian, and then Brian will open up the word. So Jared's going to come first and share.
Now, Dan said you couldn't fall asleep till Brian, so just keep that in mind. Very thankful for the opportunity for fellowship and food that we had this afternoon, and this chance I get to share a little bit with you about the ministry Grace Dental and Medical Missions just had in Ghana a couple weeks ago. Are my slides up? Do I need to click? Okay. So on January 7th, Grace Dental and Medical Missions sent a team of 7 to Ghana, West Africa. I was on that. My father was not. He went to Benin, kind of overlapping. So while we were heading home, he was actually heading out to Benin. When we were in Amsterdam, he was in Brussels, just like 30 miles away or 60 miles away, something like that. It was pretty cool. So we had a really good ministry there. It was our second time serving there. We were really excited to go back because the first time it went really well. The nationals that we work with over there are just so excited about the gospel, so excited about sharing the word, and it's always a blessing to be with them. God really provided for us throughout the trip. He did that in a number of ways. He especially did it through all the travel. We had safe flights, safe driving on the road, even though at times it could be a little sketchy. The mission sent out a little bit of money to help fix one of the vans because it had like frame rot, and we thought, okay, that's a normal thing. We'll send some money out because it'll be the nationals were using that to bring people to help at the clinics every day. And since our doctor and his wife got delayed a day, we actually had a day to do some touristy stuff. So we went to a river and went out on a dugout canoe and saw some hippos in the same water that we were on the dugout canoe. The ladies on the team thought that it would be like an enclosed habitat. Turned out we were in the habitat with them. but that was really exciting and a good way to get the heart pumping at the start of the trip. And it turned out that the van we used for that trip was the one that we had sent money out to fix. And as we were riding along, I was sitting in the back seat and I looked down and I could see the ground passing underneath us from a hole in the van. But God provided safety on the roads. He provided ease with customs. It can always be a little complicated going to other countries with a bunch of medical equipment and medicines. Sometimes they like to give you a bit of a difficult time, but they actually let us right through this time. It was really easy, and we're thankful for that. Even with COVID regulations, last year it was a little complicated to get in with all the testing and protocols that they had for us, but this year they relaxed a lot of those, and we're very thankful for that. And also God provided in rescheduling flights. Like I said, our doctor and his wife were delayed today, but God still got them on time so that we were able to do the full ministry that we had planned. We worked in 6 different villages, each of which had a church. And the way it works out there is there's sort of this assembly of churches that all came out of this one church, and they all collaborate together on things like this, big evangelism outreaches like this. And it's really a cool thing and challenging, thinking about how should we be working together with other believers, not just focusing on only being with our church. We should be with our church, but it's really cool to see other believers, and we should always be excited when there's other believers. And so a lot of you might not know, or some of you might not know kind of what GDM does, what a normal ministry day looks like for us. So I thought I'd kind of run you through that way. This presentation and then my dad's will make sense. So a normal clinic day starts with a gospel presentation. Usually by the time our team gets there, to whatever village, church, school building, tree we're working under. Normally whenever we get there, there's people gather there because they do canvassing. They tell people that we'll be there. So people show up and they're all gathered. And you can see here the pastor in one of those pictures is giving a gospel presentation. The other one, there are just people waiting who've already heard the gospel. So that's the first start of the day. We like to start the day with the gospel. We want them to know that we are there not just to help with their physical needs, but mostly or entirely for their spiritual needs. We wouldn't be doing it if we didn't think we would have that opportunity. So there's the gospel presentation. Then right after that, each person goes into registration, and there they fill out a contact form, which is really cool that even in remote areas, like we were working in villages that didn't have power, didn't have running water, or plumbing, or anything like that, but still pretty much everyone had a cell phone and thus a way to be contacted. So that allows us to take that information, and then when we leave, we can hand it back over to the national pastors and those working over there so that they can do the follow-up ministry, reach out to the people that said they wanted to do a Bible study, that made a profession of faith, things like that. So that's the second part, is the registration. After that, everyone goes to one-on-one evangelism. And this kind of varies trip to trip depending on how many people we have with us, depending if they speak English in the country. And this is my favorite part of the whole thing, is seeing people hearing the gospel one-on-one, getting the opportunity to be a part in that. Faith and I both had several opportunities to share the gospel with people in a one-on-one setting. And it's just really cool to take a step back, see all these conversations, see God doing the work. So that's the most important part of our process. After that, if they're there for medical, they would go to triage. They would see the nurses, get some medical history, things like that. And then after the nurses, they would go to see the doctor. And he would, do what doctors do, having a little appointment with them. If they need medicine, send them on to pharmacy. Or if they're not there for the doctor, they would go to dental. There's our pharmacy there. So it was a really busy trip. That's just a fun picture that I'll leave up there for a while. It was a really busy trip, but also very good. In the 6 days that we did village clinic ministry, we saw right around 700 people, which is a lot of patients a day for a doctor and a dental hygienist. So we're very thankful that they were able to keep going the whole time, that their brains didn't get burned out. But it was just such an exciting opportunity that God blessed us with. And we wouldn't have been able to do it without the believers there. Each day that we showed up at the clinics, you can see here there were around 20 nationals from the different churches that showed up to help us each day. Those are people involved in translating for us, people involved in evangelism, people just helping to make sure things go smoothly, that it ran well, that they would get food for us and the rest of the helpers and things like that. And it can be easy for us to think about how much we're sacrificing, those of us coming from the States, going to Ghana, how much we're sacrificing to be there. But each of these people gave up at least a week of their lives to make sure this was happening. And they were getting up early every morning, traveling from far away to be at the different villages that we served at. And it's just such a challenge thinking of, would we be willing to do that? If there was something like an outreach like that happening here, obviously it wouldn't be exactly like that, but would we be willing to make those sacrifices? Just the thing to think about. I was also excited to see all the young people that showed up and worked with us there. It can be easy to think of Christianity and even religion in general as an older person thing. And you see that a lot in the States. Not all the time, obviously. Looking at our assembly, it's not confined to just one generation. But in Ghana, the churches we were working with, it was so many young people, men my age, men younger than me, just showing up every day, so excited to share the gospel. And I feel like I kind of needed to see that. I guess I didn't need to see it, but God let me see it to encourage me, to get me excited. So they're the ones that are doing the most essential work. They're doing the follow-up after we leave, and they're making sure that the seeds that were planted when we were there get watered, and God's using them powerfully in that. And so I just had a story that I wanted to share, and then I'll hand it over to my father. I was able to preach in the church that we were at on Sunday. That was a really cool opportunity. It was my first time preaching with a translator. Pastor Matthew, one of the nationals, was translating for me. It actually made it, in my mind, easier because I had time to think about what I was going to say before each next one. Whereas here, I'm just talking as I think. And Pastor Matthew had been asking if there were any visitors, and there were several ladies that raised their hand, and it was their first time coming, and we had just seen them in the clinic the day before. And so that was exciting to see immediate fruit from our work. It was I think 3 Muslim ladies that were there, and it was their first time at the church. And then afterwards, Pastor told us about these 4 other ladies in the assembly that he had told us made professions of faith at the clinic last year that we hosted in the village of Zhang. And each one of them was still faithfully attending the church. And that's awesome. That's clearly God working. But an even cooler aspect of the story is that they were Muslims before they received Christ. And none of their husbands had made professions of faith. And in that culture, it is very rare for a wife to be able to attend church if her husband is a Muslim. He just wouldn't let her do it. And we asked the pastor how likely that is, and he said maybe 5%, or 1 out of 20 husbands would be okay, my wife can attend this church. But he had gone and asked all 4 of their husbands if they were okay with it, and each of them said, yes, we're seeing them. They didn't say they were seeing them grow, but they said they were seeing changes with them, and they wanted them to keep going to church. And that was such a cool and encouraging thing to see, how God used our ministry last year, and that there's lasting fruit And that's just an example from that one church. We served in several churches over there. And it was just a real blessing that the Lord allowed us to see that. And one of the older ladies that got saved last year and was attending asked where the man that looked like me but older was. And we had to tell him that he wasn't here, wasn't able to make it, and people were sad. And anyway, it was fine. But the the trip was really good. God worked powerfully, and I just would ask that you would continue to pray for the believers over there in Ghana, in the main city as well, that you would that God would bless them in the follow-up ministry, and that He would continue to work there. Thank you.
Do pray about WA. Pastor Matthew, who I've been communicating with since like 2014, is a faithful man, and it's been encouraging to see his ministry. They are actually, Jared and the team were able to see a part of the property. They would actually like a full-time clinic connected to the church and for the outreach ministry, and pray with us as we consider that. So as Jared and the team were coming back from Ghana, I and Steve and Kat were headed out to Benin. And this was our team that was in Benin. We pulled from our staff at the clinic up north and brought down some of those staff members to help us in a number of village outreaches. The main goal of the ministry to Benin was not so much to minister, to do clinics, which is our usual kind of model. That was part of it. We did 5 days of ministry, clinic ministries, which I'll show you in a bit. It was also a part of, we wanted to gather our staff from the clinic up north and to have a retreat with them. And so 20 of our staff came down, and we were able to encourage and strengthen them. It's been a year and a half since our missionaries up there were evacuated and not allowed to come back up there. And our staff were left kind of on their own. And the Lord has blessed, and the ministry continues. But it's been a rough year and a half, and so we wanted to have a retreat for them, and the Lord blessed that. The third and really the bigger part of this trip was Steve and Katrina have been praying for, since they were evacuated in November the year before, that the Lord would show them where they ought to be serving. Originally, before they were evacuated, they were going to continue serving in Benin, in northern Benin, expanding the capabilities of the clinic, adding maternity and surgical, and obviously the Lord closed those doors. And since then, they've been wondering where is the Lord going to have us. And so this was a major reason why we did this ministry, was to explore some of those possibilities. So here's a map of just where we're at. Ghana is over here, and that's Accra down there, and Wa is up here in the north. And then we were ministering in Benin, and you can see this dot right here is Boikong, which I'll mention, and then kind of in the middle here is Parakou, where Colin and the Ovanels are setting up their new station, and part of our Thanksgiving offering is going towards a camp and conference center there in Parakou, and then up north is where the Benin clinic was. So that gives you kind of just a visual. I guess I could have gone to this slide and given you a little bit more detail, right? So our first 5 days, we flew into Cotonou, and then we drove up to Boikong. And Boikong is a busy town, a lot of traffic, a lot of things happening in the street, people selling and yelling and riding and everything else. And so a very, very busy place, very much unlike the north of the country. Northern Benin is sparsely populated. It's predominantly 99% Muslim. Boyokong there's a much greater mix in terms of religions. There's Beninese cults, there's a lot of animism, and then there's the whole charismatic scene, and just there's a whole mix of religious views in this part of the country. We served in different, really in one main village, the village of Tenji, but in 3 different locations. And each day we'd have about 300 people who were there hoping to get care. And I think we averaged about 125 each day that we were serving. And so there were always almost a couple hundred people left over who were wanting care. And that was always fun to deal with. We were working with a church there in Tenji under Pastor Andre, who's an older gentleman with a real heart for people and a solid group of believers, a small group, but a solid group of believers who are part of the assembly. And so this was our effort to try to help their ministry and expand their ministry. The church has been planted for a while. And actually, when it was planted, they were chased out and stones thrown at the church, at the people as they were gathering. There was a lot of resistance earlier on. And so they are thankful for the Lord allowing us to do these clinics and to do them safely. So here's Emmanuel. Emmanuel is a believer in the church. He was helping me register, and as Jared said, the first thing in the morning would be preaching, and once the preaching happened, it was, okay, hurry up and get these people registered so we can close registration so people can kind of know that they shouldn't expect anything else beyond the ones we've registered. And Emmanuel was just a faithful guy. He'd come in the morning, help register. He had to go to work at 3 and 3 in the afternoon, but that was fine. It worked out great. Katrina here, triage. Katrina poking some young girl. We poked a lot of kids malaria tests, and a lot of kids with malaria that we were able to treat. So triage, you have Kat. Kat's a nurse with a lot of experience. Ozifa is a nurse, one of our lead nurses up at the clinic, and just a really hard worker, very knowledgeable. So Ozifa there treating. This is Mustafa. Mustafa is, sorry, it's not Mustafa, it's Madoshe. Mustafa is one of our other staff members. Madoshe is he's in his 6th year in medical school. We have been helping support him in training for medical school. And he was in another country. It's been very difficult for him, but he was helping us out, and it was good to get to know him a little bit better and work together with him. Dr. Steve, doing what Dr. Steve does, as Jared said, and then Josue Oda. Josue was really one of the catalysts for our starting the clinic up north. After we started the clinic, he went to Burkina Faso to do a specialty in ophthalmology, and so he came along with our team to do some eye stuff. I think this is a video. It's not as exciting as I thought it would be, but this is what our last day of clinic, and the pastor is preaching to this group of people. Thankful for the evangelism side of things. There's Marcel. Marcel was he was one of our evangelists. There were a number of them. Marcel was really sold out to sharing the gospel with people. And it was funny, we were riding back up north together, and and he's saying in the back of the car, I'm going to be calling these pastors, Pastor Andre and the other pastor, every week to make sure that they've followed up on the investment that I've made here with these people, sharing the gospel with them. He was just so excited. And in fact, his village is near Tenji, and he's hoping, he graduates from the Bible Institute this year, and he's hoping to then go and start, plant a church there. These were some of the other evangelists. Here's some just random pictures. This is this girl finding out that I'm going to have to poke her to get him to draw blood. Not very excited there. The girl up front had already had her blood drawn. She'd already been poked, but the girl in the back, she was not certain about wanting to have that happen. This guy told us he was 117 years old. A lot of them don't know when they were actually born, so they just make up. And usually at registration, I have so much fun with a lot of these ladies because they'll tell me, a lady who's clearly older than I am, and she'll tell me, I'm 25. And so we have a lot of fun going back and forth, and they don't care. The second part of our time there was a retreat with staff, and it was such a blessing. Haven't seen these guys since COVID started. This is Latifu, a young man he's a lab. He leads our lab at the clinic in Boifo. But really has a heart for the Lord and for ministry. As a young family, I met his child that I'd never met, but just a wonderful young man, and many of them are staff, just precious people who the Lord is using here. Part of our meeting was fellowshipping together. It was 100 degrees, and we had a bonfire. So that was a lot of fun. I think you know that song, right? What a blessing to sing with other believers of our faith. Steve and Kat had brought marshmallows and chocolate and graham crackers and showed the staff one of our American traditions around the fire. They just had a fun time. I was able to encourage them. Colin preached, Pastor Isak preached, and Steve preached. And it was just a real blessing to spend the time together. So this was Friday, Saturday, Sunday afternoon they went back because Monday they had to open the clinic again. And there was a number of staff that had to stay with the clinic because of patients that were there and so on. But it was a blessing. And then we did some games with them, and that was fun. One of the blessings that came out of this, I told you, one of our desires was Steve and Kat for the Lord's leading in their lives. And they arrived back in the States the day before yesterday, and Steve's texting me or messaging me from Paris. He's basically saying, we've decided we're going back. We now know our model. Now we got to figure out the timing. When are we going? Are we going this fall, next fall? What's the Lord's timing? So that was a real answer to prayer to see the Lord leading them. And in the future, we'll share a little bit more in terms of the model ministry that they'll be pursuing. Thank you for your patience in that. Turn in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 6. There's no end time to these afternoon services. I'm told we can go to as long as we want, right? Till everybody falls asleep. No. I'm well aware that we've eaten well, we've fellowshipped, and I want to be conscious of time this afternoon. But I do want to point us to the Word. And Matthew chapter 6 has been on my heart, specifically verse 1 through 18, and really the idea here that your Father who sees in secret will reward you. The reward of God and the heart that He desires from His people. So the context to this is Matthew chapter 5. And of course, in Matthew chapter 5, you have the great Sermon on the Mount. You have the Beatitudes in verse 2. And Jesus tells us, he preaches this sermon. I'm not going to try to go over it. But he is calling his disciples. He is warning them. He says in after the Beatitudes and the rest of chapter 5, you have this phrase, "You have heard that it was said, but I say to you." Verse 21, 27, 31, 33, 38, and 43, Jesus gives these warnings. And Jesus is calling his followers to take sin seriously in this passage. Verse 17 is kind of an example. Look at verse 17 through 20. "Do not think," Jesus says, "that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I say unto you, until heaven and earth passes away, not one iota, not a dot will pass away until the law, or from the law, until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter into the kingdom of heaven." So Christ is calling his followers to take sin seriously. And in the following verses, he calls them to put away anger and lust and divorce and falsehood and retaliation. We often can mask or hide external manifestations of these sins, but Christ is concerned with the heart. If you take his teaching, for example, in verse 21 and 24. Look at verse 21 and 24 through 24 of chapter 5. He's talking about murder and anger here. He says in verse 21, "You have heard that it was said to those of old." There's that phrase. What had they heard? "You shall not murder." This is actually in the law, right? "You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable of judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable of the council, and whoever says you fool will be liable of hellfire." So if you are offering your gift at the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are still going with him to court. In this passage, Jesus is talking about murder. Murder is sin. In the heart of the murderer is really anger, he says. And anger should have no room in our hearts. To lash out in anger against a brother, to verbally insult and assault others shows that we have murderous hearts within. The sin of anger should have no abiding place in the heart of those who are followers of Christ. But Jesus takes it a step further, and Jesus says that if you know that your brother has something against you, you leave your gift at the altar and go and seek reconciliation. Whoa. Not if you have something against your brother, leave your gift and go and reconcile. He says, if you know your brother has something against you, leave your gift, go and reconcile. Jesus lays the responsibility of pursuing peace on each of us. We don't get a pass on pursuing peace because we don't think that we did anything. This is the kind of thing that Jesus calls us to. He calls his followers to love their enemies, to pray for those who persecute you in verse 33. This is what he expects from us. Look at verse 46, or verse 43 of chapter 5. You've heard it said that you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemies, but I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. This is not natural. Verse 45. So that you may be the sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he makes the sun to rise on the evil as well as the good, and sends rain on the just and the unjust. If you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Even unbelieving people love those who love them, right? Do we expect that Christ's followers should look like the rest of humanity? Christ expects us to live out of the character of our Father who is in heaven. Verse 46 is a rhetorical question. He says, if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Well, what's the answer? No reward. What's the implication? If you love your enemies, you have reward. And here we come to this idea of reward. In Matthew 6 now, in chapter 6, this word reward will come up 7 times. Matthew uses it 2 times in Matthew 5, in 5:12, and here in verse 46, and then 7 times in chapter 6, 1 through 18, and then he only uses it 2 other times in the rest of the book. And this helps to set the stage for us. Go back to chapter 5, verse 12, 5:12, as we think about this idea of, as Jesus talks about reward. In 5:12, Jesus, having just given the Beatitudes, he says, rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. Well, let's back up to verse 11. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. We see here that Jesus talks about reward. He talks about it in 2 ways. He says that this reward is great. This reward is great, and that this reward is in heaven. The idea of great speaks of its value, its worth. And what is it worth? It is worth, Jesus says, being reviled. It is worth being slandered. It is worth being falsely accused for his name. This great reward is secondly in heaven. This reward that Jesus is talking about is not earthly. It's not temporal. In fact, it is celestial. It is eternal. It ties right into the promises that we were talking about this morning. This reward is of such value that the follower of Christ may rejoice and be glad when persecuted, even as the prophets were persecuted. This great heavenly reward is something that Christ followers should prize and pursue. We should order our lives following Christ so that we will hear one day, well done, good and faithful servant, enter into the joy of your Lord. So chapter 6, that was all the introduction. We'll go fast. Sorry. Chapter 6 then starts with this warning. Beware of practicing your righteousness before others in order to be seen by them, for then you will have no reward from your Father who is in heaven. Jesus has just talked about reward, the value of reward, the place that the reward is, the value that we should place on it. And here he says, be careful, beware. It's meant to arrest our attention. The language has changed drastically. As we said, he's had these statements, these sections that all started with, "You have heard, and now I say to you." And in chapter 6, there's a dramatic change, and it starts with this idea of beware or pay attention. A warning of danger, a call to attention. Jesus is calling his disciples to live righteously. He calls them to practice righteousness. But this righteousness is not externally motivated. It is to be Christ-centered and word-produced. Why do I say Christ-centered and word-produced? Well, if you go back to 17 in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus is talking about the Word. He says he came to not abolish the law, but he came actually to fulfill the law. He says, until heaven and earth passes away, not one iota or dot will pass away from the law until all is accomplished. So Jesus is calling us to practice a righteousness, to live out righteously before him and before our Father. And we are to live out our righteousness. It should be produced, or the product of God's unchanging, eternal Word. We need to be careful not to practice righteousness in order to be seen by others. Do we do that? I think if we're honest, this is something that we wrestle with regularly, right? And often I think we're unconscious about it. Jesus said in Luke chapter 16, and he said to them, the Pharisees, he's talking to the Pharisees, he says, "You are those who justify yourselves before men, but God knows your hearts. For what is exalted among men is an abomination in the sight of God." He then lists 3 different types of practicing righteousness. He talks about prayer, he talks about giving, and he talks about fasting. And these were good things. These are things that God had commanded. But these are things that Christ warns us about, that we be careful in doing them. We need to be doing them, but in doing them, we need to be careful. What motivates us? Are we motivated by Christ, our love for him? Are we motivated by his word, obedience to it? Or are we motivated by others? By choosing the reward of men, you disregard God's reward. By choosing the reward of men, you determine God's promise of great reward in heaven to be worthless. So, verse 2 through 4. Look at verse 2 to 4. "Thus, when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do." Can you imagine that? And I think Christ is giving us a pretty vivid picture here. I don't think any of us, as the offering plate is passed around this morning, would say, "Wait a minute, let me pull out my trumpet. Everybody eyes on me. I've got a big gift this morning," right? We know that would be wrong. But apparently some have done it. "Thus, when you give to the needy," the context of this giving would have been in the synagogue. There was often a box designated for the needs of the people, those who were needy in the community, and people would give into that. He says, "So when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets. And they do it that they may be praised by others. Truly, I say to you, they have their reward. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will" what? "Will reward you." The hypocrites sound a trumpet. They draw attention to themselves in the synagogue, in the street, looking for the praise of others. Jesus says he says, truly I say to you, they have received their reward. What is their reward? The attention of men. Is that what we want? The attention of men. There is no further reward that they have to look forward to. That's it. They have the reward of men. But he says in verse 3, but when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. Giving it to the needy is right. It's part of loving our neighbor. Jesus' disciples must themselves be given to God, that their giving is prompted by obeying God and having compassion on others. So Jesus has exercised great caution when giving, ensuring that we are not seeking to draw attention to ourselves. So subtle should be our gestures in giving that our left hand doesn't know what our right hand is doing. This is in contrast to the parading and trumpeting of the hypocrites in the street. Verse 4, he says, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in what? In secret will reward you. Your Father who sees in secret. Hebrews chapter 4 verse 13 tells us that no creature is hidden from his sight, but all are naked and exposed to the eyes of him with whom we will all give account. He sees in secret. And Jesus says he will reward you. Matthew uses, we said there are 7 words in these 18 verses that the English translates reward. Actually, there are 4 that are one word, and there are 4 that are a different word. So you have every time where Matthew says, your Father who sees in secret will reward you. That reward, that word used for reward, is different. It's a parallel word, but it's a different word. And I think it's there for emphasis. God, the idea there is God will pay you back. God will make it right. He's good for it. You can trust him. He's not going to forget about what you've done for his sake. He will not run out of resources. He will reward you. God will reward his people. Hebrews 6:10 says, he is not unjust to overlook your work and the love that you have shown in his name. God is a rewarder of his people. Listen to what Revelation chapter 11, 17 through 19 says. We give thanks to you, Lord God Almighty, who is and who was, for you have taken your great power and began to reign. The nations regard, but your wrath came, and the time for the deeds to be judged, and for rewarding your servants. There's a time coming when God will reward his servants, the prophets and the saints and those who fear your name, both small and great. He is a rewarder of those who seek him. So Jesus warns us. He says, be careful when you pray or when you give to the needy. So thus, when you give to the needy, sound no trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogue, in the streets, that they may be praised by others. Truly, I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Verse 5 through 14, he talks about prayer, and we're just going to read it and read it along with me. Verse 5, and when you pray, so when you give, and then when you pray, You must not be like the hypocrites, for they love to stand and pray in the synagogues and in the streets and the corners, that they may be seen by who? By others. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. If whatever we do is done to be seen by men, then we have our reward. We can expect no further reward for it. Verse 6. But when you pray, go into your room and shut the door and pray to your Father who is in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will reward you. When you pray, do not heap up empty phrases as do the Gentiles. God doesn't need a lot of repetition, doesn't need a lot of volume. For they think that they will be heard for their many words. I don't know, I get the picture of, you remember Elijah on Mount Carmel? And the false prophets, the prophets of Baal, praying, trying to call down fire. And Elijah mocking them. You're not crying loud enough. You're not using enough, words. I'm making things up now, but you remember the story, right? I grew up where animism was rampant, and I can tell you this is the way of the Gentiles. God knows what we need. Look at verse 7. And when you pray, do not heap up empty phrases as the Gentiles, for they think that they will be heard for their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask him. But pray then like this: Our Father in heaven, hallowed, holy is your name. Your kingdom come. We recognize the character. Our prayer is focused on our God. It's focused on what he is doing and his will. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. It recognizes our dependence on him. Give us this day our daily bread. Our dependence for forgiveness. Forgive us our debts as we also forgive our debtors. Our dependence on him for living righteously before him in the day ahead. Lead us not into temptations, but deliver us from evil. For if you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will forgive you. But if you do not forgive others their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive you your trespasses. That is a somber warning. Especially as you connect that back to the command he gave about going and pursuing peace with our brother back in 17 through 20. Finally, 16 through 18, he talks about fasting. There's a lot more we could say about prayer. Jesus is not saying that we should never have public prayer. I think there's plenty of examples of public prayer. Well, I know there are plenty of examples of public prayer, even Jesus himself. But the driving motivation here is that in our prayer, we can pray to be heard by others, right? You ever done that in shepherding group? Oh, we don't have to look far. We just have to look inside in our hearts and what we've done and who we are sometimes, and right? So we want to make sure that our heart is aligned, that what we're doing is because of who we are in Christ and who he is, and not for the applause of men. Fasting. He says in verse 16, when you fast, and by the way, all of these things Jesus says to his disciples when you do them. When you give, when you pray, when you fast. The Pharisees do this, but when you do it. So these are things that Jesus expects his disciples are going to be part of. They're going to do. This is part of their practicing righteousness. They're living rightly before God. the disciplines of grace. He says, and when you fast, do not look gloomy like the hypocrites. This is kind of comical, right? Don't look gloomy. Changing your face, for they disfigure their face, that their fasting may be seen by others. Still trying to figure out what that would look like for me. Truly I say to you, they have received their reward. But when you fast, anoint your head, wash your face, that your fasting may not be seen by others, but by your Father who sees in secret. And your Father who sees in secret will, what? Reward you. We often forget our Father who sees in secret. And this is just a reminder this evening as a body that we would be careful. We would be careful to pay attention to what God sees in our hearts before Him and not what others see. Because if we are focused on, if we are doing righteousness, if we are trying to live rightly and be seen by others, then we have no lasting reward. We only have the reward of other people thinking a certain way about us. And how lasting is that? They'll change their mind tomorrow, right? So may God help us to value this great reward, this reward that is in heaven, this reward that is the product of our exercising these means of grace, means of living rightly before God, but may we do it before Him out of a heart that is committed to Him and to His word. Father, thank you for these plain reminders today. Thank you that we could worship together as a body. We're so grateful for Jesus Christ, for your patient care for us as we seek to be conformed into your image. Bless us this week. In your name, amen. You're dismissed.